Um, Maureen Dowd had an article about Nancy Pelosi. She interviewed her for the New York Times. It was one of the most disgusting articles I've ever read. Such craven uh, bowing down to the establishment, but it's not bowing down. Maureen Dowd is the establishment. New York Times is the establishment. So it's a one big. I don't want to say circle. You know what? But they're playing patty cakes with each other. I wanted to do it on the show on Monday to give you all the full quotes, but I just can't help myself. It was just so vomitous, so vomitous. So Maureen Dowd, who's a longtime op-ed writer for the New York Times, fancies herself a bit of a rebel. Oh, please. All she's ever done is support the establishment. Oh, she's a little tough on Republicans. Ooh, Maureen, wow, you're so risky. You're so risky. Please. She barely touches them. And of course, one time after another, just kissing the ass of the establishment Democrats. But God, this was her shining example. I mean, her ode to the powerful. So let me get to some of the things that Maureen Dowd wrote, which is deeply problematic, and then what Nancy Pelosi actually said, which is way more problematic because she's the one in power. Okay, so Maureen Dowd says, Nancy Pelosi, I mean, what a hero, what a fighter. Oh my God. Just when people thought she might be at the twilight of her career, it might be her shining accomplishment to fight Trump. But then you'd have to give me one example of actually fighting Trump if you were going to be a columnist, or, anything close to someone who's in the media and a journalist, okay? No examples of it because Nancy Pelosi doesn't fight Donald Trump. So the one example Maureen Dowd had was she clapped back at him. At the State of the Union, she sarcastically clapped at him. Oh my God, the way she clapped, it was amazing. What a hero of the revolution and the rebellion, Nancy Pelosi, the way she claps. The way she claps. Later, a lot of physical things. Oh, at the end of the article, coming out of a car, she slammed her fingers in the car, which I feel bad about. I'm a lib, right? But how's this related to anything else? But she went on and put a Band-Aid on it and shook hands anyway like a politician. Oh my God, Nancy. Okay, she says that Nancy Pelosi has remarkable skill. But Maureen Dowd isn't just kissing up to Nancy Pelosi. She's also kicking down. So she's goes after progressives. Now remember, these are people who pretend to be progressives themselves. People like Maureen Dowd and Nancy Pelosi. Again, I'm going to get to Pelosi in a second. So Maureen Dowd's like, the anarchy that the progressives would cause. These progressives who, she's dismissive throughout, like, oh, they're causing trouble, but they don't know. They don't know that in order to be a remarkable legislator like Nancy Pelosi, you have to not legislate at all. Oh, I didn't think about that. Wow, that is some trippy stuff, man. Okay, so Nancy Pelosi, and in order to, again, credit Nancy Pelosi, one more thing about Dowd, I'll come back to her throughout too, but she says, did you know that Nancy Pelosi is so liberal that back in 1987, when she came into Congress, even though the Democratic elders had told her not to fight for AIDS funding and research, she said she would anyway. Okay, so let's note that in order to give Nancy Pelosi credit for being a progressive, she had to go back to 1987 to find an example. 1987! Okay, I don't know. I've lost track of how many decades ago this. I was in high school and I'm an old ass man. Back when Nancy Pelosi was so-called progressive. And by the way, fighting for AIDS while you were representing San Francisco in 1987, very, very bold. I mean, you would have been thrown out of office if you didn't do that. And notice that they give credit to Nancy Pelosi for fighting the Democratic elders back then, but then they tell progressives in the rest of the column to bow their heads at Democratic elders like Nancy Pelosi. Maureen Dowd, the brilliant columnist, missed that irony. So now let's get to Pelosi, the more important part. Pelosi says, oh, these left, they have their Twitter or whatever world that they have. And they, but they have no real support. No, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had no infrastructure and no money. Why do you think she has over 4 million Twitter followers? This is someone secretly funding her? No, because Nancy Pelosi always thinks in terms of money and only money, right? So where does she get those followers? Maybe because she has popular ideas that resonated. That's why people are like, yes. Maybe it's because she fought, and God, progressives are dying for a fighter. Dying for a fighter. That's why she's popular, and she's more popular than you, Nancy Pelosi, by a landslide. Not just in terms of Twitter followers, where she's lapped you and maybe the entire Congress combined. God, that didn't give you pause like, hey, wait a minute. This isn't Taylor Swift. This isn't some sort of celebrity. No one knew her just a year ago, right? Well, outside of us and you guys, okay? But no one knew her. Why did she spring up like this? But it's not just those social media followers. How about the actual poll numbers? Nancy Pelosi, they're like, oh, her numbers are rising. They don't tell you what the numbers are because they're rising from like 25% popularity to 27% popularity. Okay, her numbers are abysmal. Last I checked, she's 12 points underwater, negative. No one in the media ever tells you that because they work for Nancy Pelosi. They're all sycophants. They all kiss up to power, okay? So then Nancy Pelosi says, these 4 people or whatever, that's all they are. Yeah, they got support all across the country. There are only 4 in Congress. Why? Because their ideas are not popular in Congress? Well, that's somewhat true, because the rest of Congress is corrupt, like you, Nancy Pelosi. You bought them off. You raised over $500 million for the Democratic Party from corporate donors, and you sprinkled it all throughout the Democratic caucus so you would buy them all. And guess what? Now, Maureen Dowd turns around and says, you know what? Some of the people who were against her before, not noting that they were conservative Democrats, have come around and said, you know what, we were wrong. Nancy Pelosi's brilliant. You know why they're saying that, Maureen? If you were a journalist, you would know. Because it turns out they're like, holy cow, Nancy Pelosi's even more conservative than us. She's fighting Trump even less than us. I couldn't imagine that she would protect Trump, even when we know for a fact that he did 2 clear felonies, obstruction of justice and campaign finance reform violations, let alone all of the other potential legal violations, let alone all the sexual assault charges. Who would have guessed that Nancy Pelosi would defend Republicans and tax cuts for the rich and deregulation as well as any conservative in the country? So yes, the conservative Democrats have turned around and go, man, Nancy Pelosi's awesome. Did you not take note of that, Maureen Dowd, as you pretended to paint her as some sort of progressive folk hero, when in fact she is, the whole point of the column is that she is fighting against the left. So if you're fighting against the left, you might not be in the left. Again, not noted in the column. God, this is pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. So what does then Pelosi say for why she's in favor, why she's actually the real left, and that the left is what? She doesn't even explain. So she says, okay, do you know I have posters in my basement from 30 years ago for single payer? Well, how's that working out for you? If you've been fighting for single payer for 30 years, well, turns out you're terrible at this. You're not a master legislator. You're feckless. You're horrible at this. But the reality is, she hasn't been. Why do you think it's in her basement? She strangled single payer and buried it in her basement. I have a poster of single payer from 30 years ago in my basement. If I drew it up, people would be like, hey, Cenk, you're going over the top. Look, no way that Nancy Pelosi would say something so absurd. It's like an article out of The Onion, right? But no, she did. It's in the New York Times. Oh, yeah, I've been doing nothing about single payer for 30 long years. I put it in my basement. It's a poster. And Maureen Dowd's like, oh, my God, master legislator. Remarkable skill. The way she put up that poster 30 years ago and hasn't done a goddamn thing about it since. Remarkable. You got to get Nancy Pelosi out. She's not our leader. She's not the leader of anyone on the left. She's not the leader of progressives. She might be the leader of conservative Democrats. Now, the New York Times, you know what they called the people that voted with Trump on the detention centers? The New York Times, in a separate article, called them the mighty moderates. New York Times, are you ever going to do journalism? And here's what I mean by that. I want to be specific. You don't have to agree with me. I don't need your opinions. I need you to actually do objective journalism instead of being kiss asses to the establishment and the powerful. So what do I mean by that? When you see the mighty moderates, you might want to look at their funding. You might want to see how they got their power. Wouldn't that be journalism? How did they get their power? Did they get it from the voters? Well, they won an election at some point, but you might want to note that 95% of the time, the person with more money wins those elections. Well, where did they get the money? Well, if they got it from small donors and they don't take corporate PAC money like AOC and the rest of the Just Democrats, you might say, well, Their power seems to be derived from the people. She got outspent 10-1 by Joe Crowley. She won anyway, derived from the people, right? Then you look at all the conservative Democrats. Like, for example, right now there's Just Democrat Jessica Cisneros, who you should support, running against one of the most conservative Democrats there's, in fact, the most conservative Democrat there is down in Texas, okay? When you look at, his name is Cuellar. When you look at Cuellar's record, he votes with Trump 7 out of 10 times. You know what percentage of his donors are small donors? 1%. 99% of his donors are big donors, including corporations. Elliot Engel, another Just Democrat running against him in New York. He's not as conservative as Cuellar, but he's for all the wars, and he's for banking deregulation. So whenever they need his vote, he's there for the corporations and the warmongers, etc. Guess what percentage of his money comes from large donors? 99% come from large donors. So you might want to say, hey, these mighty moderates got mighty because they got bought by the corporations. You don't want to say bought? At least for God's sake, inform your readers. Where does their power derive from? They get their donations, their checks, their independent expenditures from the corporations who bought them. That is who those moderate, so-called moderate Democrats represent. And they're not moderates. They do not agree with the center of the country. I can show you a dozen polls, which I have over and over again, where the country is massively progressive. They are not the center of the country. They are not moderates. They're corporate Democrats. They're owned, lock, stock, and barrel by the big donors. And top of that list, at the top of that heap, is Nancy Pelosi. We got to get her out by all means. Vote her out, protest her out, get her out, build a caucus. She is never, ever going to fight for you. She's never going to fight against Trump. And then finally, look, I can go on, and maybe we'll do it again on Monday because I'm leaving out 1,000 quotes from that hideous article. And the title of it is, It's Nancy Pelosi's Parade. Oh, okay. Nancy Pelosi says, you don't lead on Twitter. You don't get anything done on Twitter. We're trying to get things done. Really? Name it. It's a challenge to Nancy Pelosi. Name it. Name what you're trying to get done. Because you said you get $15 minimum wage. AOC didn't say that. You said that, Nancy Pelosi. You said that if they got Democratic majority, that we'd have it within 100 hours, that at least the House would pass it. Have they passed it? No. You're either not a master legislator, you're feckless, clueless, and completely incompetent, or you never wanted to pass it in the first place. It was all a trick to pretend to be progressive because you know the voters are progressive. And then when you get into power, corporations. You don't want your wages, the wages of your employees going up? No, we'll kill it. We'll say a conservative Democrat in Alabama is opposed to it, and that's literally what they said. So one conservative Democrat apparently can kill it. So because it dismisses the progressives, it's just 4 people in Congress. The only 4 that are not corrupt. She's wrong about that, by the way. Ro Khanna, Pramila Jayapal, Raul Grijalva, also part of the Just Democrats, also not corrupt, also fighting for real change, and more to come, okay? But she dismisses them as just 4 people. But it just takes one corporate conservative Democrat to say, no, I don't want the minimum wage increased. My corporate donors don't want it. And Nancy Pelosi immediately bows down to corporations and says, okay, nope, we're done with it. And the press, did anyone hold her accountable? What happened to your promises? What happened? Did the New York Times hold her accountable? Nope. Did the New York Times talk about her failure, her miserable failure to pass the $15 minimum wage, which she promised? Nope. Barely a word about it, except article after article, bowing down and trying to please Nancy Pelosi and catering to power. That's who the New York Times is, holding no one accountable, especially if they're in corporate Democratic leadership. If you're so busy not impeaching, what are you working on? The only thing you got passed recently was the detention center bill, just like Donald Trump wanted. You didn't get it changed. You didn't make it more progressive. You gave him everything you wanted. New York Times, for God's sake, hire a journalist and do your job. Actually look at her record. Look at how much she has supported Donald Trump and how she is not fighting for a single progressive priority. She also talks down about Medicare for all, about the Green New Deal. She calls it the Green Dream or whatever. She sent her top staffer to go assure the healthcare industry, don't worry, I'll never let Medicare for all happen. And I'm supposed to celebrate this as my leader? No, she's my opponent. She's the opponent of everyone on the left and every progressive in the country. Fire Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. Fire her today. Young Turks.